What is up, guys? Welcome to Real Talk, the unedited, scripted, unfiltered show where I sit down with a gaming personality and talk about anything and everything. Today's guest is one of the most respected and well-known journalists in the gaming space. He's been on both sides of the industry and is responsible for hosting the CGW Radio podcast, an immensely popular podcast with fans waiting week after week to get their hands on the coveted MP3. I'm honored to introduce and speak with Jeff Green. Jeff, how's it going, man?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm,
You're,
I'm glad that you can make it.
yeah, no problem. You said a lot there about respect for me, which I don't know.
It's kind of funny. Do you remember, actually, I think PAX last year, it was at the Giant Bomb panel. I was there with my, at the time, girlfriend. I actually introduced myself to you.
Holy shit!
And because I've been watching and following the podcast for a long, long time. And it was afterwards. I just said, like, hi, nice to meet you, and walked
Oh
off
my
after
gosh!
that.
Oh,
So
how funny!
I felt it, I'd never been in that position before where I felt anxious to speak to someone. And so there I
That's
was at PAX East, that guy.
Wow, that's funny. I honestly, to be totally honest, I don't remember.
Yeah, you never
But
do.
now,
I'm
but
the
now
same
we know
way.
each other well, so
There you go.
it all worked out. Yeah, that's always a weird thing for me. I mean, because I've experienced that, and I do experience it in my own life with people, that I'm a fan of or whatever, and I
Right.
get tongue-tied in the same way. And it's so funny and weird. It's just weird for me if I ever see someone doing that with me, because to me, I'm just, I'm just a dork in Berkeley, and it's no big deal. I mean, my wife and kid keep me humble every day. So, not that I need any help on that score, but, it's weird when someone, at PAX in Boston last time, this woman came up to me and she said, listen, my husband is a big fan of yours, but he's just way too shy to say hi. So will you please go over there and say hi to him? And she points, and this poor guy is like 20 feet away, like looking down, looking all sheepish. And I just like, geez, man, it's flattering, but it's not that big a deal to meet me.
Yeah,
It really
yeah.
isn't.
It. I've had some similar experiences, kind of in the esport world, where a lot
I
of people
bet.
just ask for autographs, and I'm like, yeah, if you really want this, like, I'll sign your laptop,
Yeah.
I guess. I feel really terrible for having doing this, but
Yeah.
whatever you want, man,
Yeah.
it's totally up to you.
I
So,
know. I
so
mean,
yeah.
I appreciate it for
Oh,
sure.
totally,
It
totally.
feels great. Like I'd be lying if I said it didn't. It feels awesome.
Right.
And the best times have always been when it's somebody who doesn't know me from this life, who, when that happens, like in public or something, like that always feels really good, because then I can go, see, I am somebody to some people.
Exactly.
I know you don't really think my career is a big deal, but these people recognize me on the street.
Exactly.
So that, if only that could happen with my parents, then maybe they feel I had done something.
Right,
with
right.
my life.
I try to keep mine away from all the esports events. I don't want them going to the same
Yeah.
thing, to the same place. So before we get started, I do want to remind everyone that this will be a 3-part interview, and each part will be posted as a separate VOD. So, Jeff, let's go ahead and just get started, man. Where were you
Sure.
born, and where did you grow up?
I was born in Los Angeles, California, actually specifically the San Fernando Valley. So I'm a full-on Valley dude, and that's where I grew up. I grew up in Van Nuys and Sherman Oaks. This was in the 1970s, or I was born in 1961. I'll be a full disclosure on just how old I am. So I'm a child of the 60s and the early 70s. And I was in LA all the way through until I left for college in Berkeley. And I've been in Berkeley ever since. So
Now, what did your
um,
parents do for work while you were in LA?
um, my father was a real estate appraiser, and he's 82 now, and he didn't even retire that long ago. He worked well into his 70s. And my mom was she was a teacher for a long time in the 60s, and in the early 70s they got divorced, and she got involved with like crisis hotline stuff. It was like a very 70s thing to do. And then later in her later career, she was a human resources manager at this big corporation, which was a great resource for me to have in my career. Was to have this HR person who was my mom, and I could call her and go like, "Mom, it seems like they're treating me like shit here. What do you think?" So that was great. But yeah, my father was in real estate. I have one brother who's a year younger than me, and he works with my father, or worked with my father in real estate. So I was sort of the black sheep who didn't go that way.
Ah.
And like a lot of Los Angeles middle class Jews, my entire family is basically like, either real estate or lawyers or doctors. I have a few surgeons in my family, and a whole bunch of people in the entertainment industry. I am the one who ended up somehow in video games.
Would you say your parents were the type of parents to kind of like steer you and do what they wanted in their or in your daily life, or did they kind of let you do what you want? I mean, you said you ended up in an industry completely separate from the rest of your family, so.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. They were, because of the time I was raised too, which was late '60s, early '70s. They did have a very kind of laissez-faire attitude towards me. That was very much like, we're going to let Jeff discover his passion, kind of thing. And I got no push whatsoever. And there was a long period in my life where I actually, since this is called Real Talk, where I actually kind of resented them for that. Like, I wished that I had had more direction. Like, when I got to Cal Berkeley in 1980, I was not prepared. I did not know I was not prepared until I got there and I saw how prepared other kids were. And I was like, man, like, I just sort of coasted through junior high and high school. I had straight A's, but like, I was in gigantic public schools in LA where there was no challenge whatsoever, except I didn't even really know that. I was just in my own bubble, just doing really well, but not understanding that I wasn't actually getting educated. All I was doing was gaming the system and getting A's without really learning much of anything. Like, I didn't really learn how to write an essay. I didn't learn how to analyze a piece of literature. Like, I learned it while at college.
Right.
But a lot of kids, the smart kids, the prepared kids, learn it before they get to college. So, I really had wished at the time that they had given me a little more direction, a little more focus. My college years, honestly, were not particularly great. I was not successful. I like barely got a BA, and I really didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I had a lot of fun, so there's that.
Sure.
And there's something to be said for that being part of the college experience. But, if I could go back and do it over again, I would do it totally different, and at least try to pay attention in class part of the time.
You mentioned
what
you
are
were.
you going to do?
Yeah. You mentioned you were a good student kind of in grade school, and I would assume in high school as well.
Mm-hmm.
Did you fit in with any particular cliques? Were you part of the smart crew? Like, where would you say you fit in?
Yeah, in elementary school, I was definitely part of like the little nerdy kids. I was like one of the shortest boys in class, and we were all. Yeah, I was like part of the they weren't called nerds or geeks back then, but that's certainly what we were. That is who I fit in with. I was in the quote unquote gifted program, whatever the hell that means, and those were the kids I hung out with. Later in junior high and high school, I was just a classic awkward pre-adolescent, adolescent. Just everything that could go wrong went wrong. I had you can't tell from looking at me now, but I had flaming red hair at the time. I was nearsighted. I had braces. I had acne. Everything that could go wrong for self-image wise, I had that going for me. And so I was not one of the cool kids by a long stretch. in junior high and high school, and I ended up gravitating towards like the band, the band kids, and then I hung out with the school paper kids. So those were sort of the band and the newspaper were kind of the groups that I got involved with early on. Um, and because I'm so old, and I think this is a later question, but I actually predate the start of D&D. So
Sure.
D&D, came in the '70s, but you know, uh, what I did do before that was me and a few friends got into the Avalon Hill board games, like the war games, these World War II games with the hexagons. That was like my first early geeky gaming experience. But yeah, I hung out with the nerds. I was a nerd, and that's who I hung out with.
Outside of school, was it kind of just the same then? You stayed at home, you did the nerdy things, you did your work, and then you went to school the next day, or?
I was a big nerd. I was a big nerd. My brother, who's younger than me, he was actually like a cool kid. He was on the swim team. He was like good looking. He had girlfriends like years before I did, which was really great. Great for your self image as an older brother. And he and his friends. I remember that they used to call me a hermit. Like that was one of my nicknames because I was just always in my room, reading Mad Magazine or doing whatever, playing Avalon Hill board games by myself, while he would be outside with the cool kids. So yeah, I was very much an indoors dude. I was not a sporty guy whatsoever. Just full on classic geek.
When did you? What was it up until college? You said you kind of had to discover what you wanted to do when you got to college, and you weren't that prepared. Was it always writing for you, or was that something you discovered while at college?
No, no, the writing was always there. That was just something that I did from the time I was a little kid. I don't, you know, I can't say why. It's just something I fell into. It just always felt right to me. I learned early on that I could do it, and I there were certain kinds of writing that I really liked to do, mostly comedic writing. In junior high was the first time that I ever really went for it, and me and a couple friends wrote a series of plays that we put on that were all pretty funny. I don't know if they'd be funny now, but they were certainly funny, to 14-year-old boys at the time. Um, so I did always want to be a writer. So that was there. But what happened, when I got to college, not really having the kind of parental guidance that I would have wanted, I didn't really have the self confidence or the belief in myself that that was a real career path that I should pursue. I never really got positive strokes from my parents saying, "Gee, Jeff, you're a really good writer. You should pursue writing." It was
Sure.
almost more the opposite. It was more like, "Gee, Jeff, if you want to do something with your life, maybe you should go to law school." Except I had I had no affinity for anything like that. It didn't interest me at all. So I wanted to be a writer, but I had no belief that that was a real career that I could actually pursue, that I was good enough to be able to do that. And so I didn't. And in fact, I was so shy at the time, and I was so not confident in my abilities that I walked into the school paper called the Daily Cal at UC Berkeley. It's probably still called the Daily Cal. And I walked in when I was a freshman, probably my first week, yeah, determined to work for the newspaper. And I walked right out. I looked in, I looked around, I saw everybody working, and I was just too shy, and I was just like, nah, nah. And I went back to the dorm and probably smoked a joint or something. And and so I didn't. I I wanted to be a writer. I always wanted to be a writer, and it wasn't until later, and when we can get to that, as we talk about my first jobs, that I built up the confidence to feel like I could do it professionally. It took time to get there.
Was there any inspiration in terms of kind of books that these days that you'll go back and read, or anything that really brought that out in you, that whether you could or could not write, it still you wanted to? Was there anything like that you
Yeah,
read back then?
there definitely were, and it was all like the comedic, all the classics like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, those books, Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. That was the kind of stuff I gravitated towards. Very much comedic writing. Woody Allen has had a series of paperbacks back at the time. They're still in circulation. They were short essays that always cracked me up, and those were early inspirations. As was Mad Magazine, which I was just that was the glory days of Mad Magazine in the late '60s, early '70s, and I was religiously addicted to it, and probably more than I realized was a guiding inspiration for me. I think it gave me the kind of sense of humor that I have, and uh, it back then when I was a kid, if I could have said what my dream job would be, it would have been to write for Mad Magazine. I think that's what I wanted to do. Yeah. Um,
Did that ever
so
did that ever go anywhere? Like, did you try maybe post college applying there,
yeah,
or
I never did, and that's the thing.
okay?
That's where like I feel like I don't have regrets in my life. I don't. Like I'm pretty happy with where I landed. But again, if I could go back and do things over, that would be the kind of thing that if I felt like if I'd had a little more self confidence, I would have tried those things. And I do believe that, you know, I would have had to work at it, but I think I could have done it. You know, in high school, the closest I got to doing that was I was on the school paper, and once a year we did like the April Fool's issue,
Mm.
which was a parody of the school paper. And I was in charge of that from the time I was either a freshman or sophomore because I just had an affinity. I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm doing the joke issue. Like, let me do it. I may not believe in myself in other ways, but I know I can do this. So please make me in charge of this. And so I was. And every time it was like the moment of glory, the only ones I had in high school when that came out, because they ended up pretty good. And and if you read my yearbooks at the time, you'll see comments like, I know you'll be at Mad Magazine one day. That was the kind of things that friends wrote. But I never did it. It really wasn't until to jump way ahead. It wasn't until I got to Computer Gaming World magazine that I had proposed a back page column. I mean, they had another columnist there at the time, but I really I wanted it, and I wanted it to be a humor column. And that was the first time in my life that I got to really do that thing. I got to write like a funny column for money, and it ended up being popular. And that was probably one of my all-time career highs, was getting that column. And that was where I felt like I had achieved something that I felt when I was a kid I was destined to do.
Sure.
Like that. So I got to it, but in a really roundabout way. And it took. I was pretty much a late bloomer. I was already in my 30s by the time that happened.
Well, we'll get to the computer gaming world career
Yeah.
and whatnot for sure. But
Yeah.
to jump back to college, the college
Sure.
experience. I mean, you said that you were not that outgoing. Did that change throughout the entire experience, or was that steady the entire way through? Did you ever grow out of your shell?
No, I did, and I think when I look back at college now, and I really try to analyze it um, objectively, decades after, you know, if I want to look at like my GPA and I want to look at like how I did in class, it's kind of a catastrophe. But when I look at like how I grew and changed as a person, then I feel like I did what was necessary for myself at the time as a 17, 18-year-old boy. Like I was not ready at that point in my life to be academically challenged and to work hard, but I was motivated, in fact, to discover that side of myself. I mean, it's an advantage of going to a school like Berkeley. That was where I found out, like, whoa, this is an entire school of nerds. Like, I'm not a freak here. And so that was the first time I really was able to come out of my shell and have a lot of friends. So, really, I do look back at college. I look back at the school part as like kind of a nightmare, but the social part as great. and extremely necessary.
There's been a photo floating around. We were kind of discussing it earlier of you playing the bass.
Yeah,
What was that during college? Were you
that
part of a
was
band?
yeah, that was right after college.
Okay.
Yeah, that was during one of the first jobs I had. If we want to get to that sequentially later, yeah, I was mid-20s at the time of that photo, so
Yeah.
right
Okay.
after
We'll
college.
get to that
Yeah,
then. We'll get to
yeah,
that then
yeah,
in the professional life, one might say.
yeah, yeah.
Apart from that, did you in college? Did you kind of do anything apart from going to college, or did you really stick to that once you got into it?
Yeah, I was really, now that I've lived in Berkeley in the Bay Area, for decades after, I realized like how small my world was at the time. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people in college. I think it's fairly true of my own daughter who's in college in New York City. Is you kind of make the campus like your life, right? And
Hmm.
your whole life is sort of the perimeter around the school of like half a mile outside any direction, and that's sort of what I did. But uh, the kinds of things that I did were, well, for one thing, it was mostly pre-video games. By the end of my college career, were the earliest video game arcades.
Mm.
There was Silverball in Berkeley. I don't know if it still exists, but I played pinball for years and years. And in fact, to give you an idea of how what a catastrophe my undergraduate education was, I actually played pinball during one of my finals on purpose because I knew there was no point in me taking the final. Basically, the professor let me know that, and
Mm.
so I was like, well, screw it, I'm just going to go play pinball. So I did that. Um, so I did that for a pastime a lot. I've always been a huge live music fan, always. That goes back to high school. So I was always going to see bands in Berkeley and San Francisco at mostly now defunct clubs. But music was always a secondary pastime of mine.
Who are
And
some of
one
your
of the,
favorite bands that you saw back then?
um, my very favorite band that I saw back then was Talking Heads, who I got to see about 7 or 8 times.
Wow.
And I got to see the famous Stop Making Sense tour that they made the movie out of. I saw that 2 nights in a row at Berkeley, and that was one of the greatest experiences, live experiences of my life. Um, because I was 16 in 1977 and was such a nerd and such a kind of an outcast, I really gravitated towards the whole punk scene because I felt very alienated like that. The funny thing was, I felt so shy and alienated that like I couldn't be a punk either. Like I felt like I wasn't cool enough for them. But I gravitated towards that kind of music, and that is where I met a lot of other friends, kind of like me,
Mm.
and so we got into a lot of bands like the Minutemen and Husker Du, and a lot of those early '80 bands that were kind of like pre-grunge, like pre-Nirvana, really. The Ramones I saw a number of times back in the day, the Clash. So I was into all that stuff, and I saw all those bands, and I have extremely fond memories of doing that. Um, yeah, I once made a list of. I started making a list of all the bands I've seen, and I'm pretty lucky, you know. I never saw the Beatles. I was too young for that.
Yeah.
I saw the Who after Keith Moon died. I saw the rest of them.
Mm.
But yeah, so I saw a lot of live music. Yeah, Elvis
Gotcha.
Costello, another big one.
When did video games start to be a thing in your life? When did that become a pretty big thing? Was that not till kind of the professional career or?
Well, no, it came into my life, but just remember that like it really started after I was already, I mean, there weren't video games when I was a kid, so
Right,
I was
right, right.
already basically in my 20s at the time that they started appearing, other than those first early arcade machines, which I was all over.
Hmm.
But like for my generation, at least me and my friends, like those machines were very suspect at the beginning. Of course, eventually we gravitated towards them, and my personal game was Missile Command. That was the one that I poured I don't know how many tons and tons of quarters into. But all those machines, Space Invaders, Missile Command, and then later things like Dragon's Lair, were very much like ruining the arcades for us. Like the real machines were the pinball machines, and these arcade machines were just like bullshit things for like the younger kids who didn't know how to play pinball.
Sure.
So like I had to kind of get over that at first, and then in terms of like actual video gaming and home consoles, I had a good friend who had a Commodore 64, and that sort of was one of the first. That actually was my first experience with like a home gaming thing, and that was also around the time that like the first NES came out. I didn't own those machines, but I had friends who did own those machines, so I started being around games at that point in my life.
Sure.
But again, yeah, I don't have the experience of having had video games as a boy. I'm always jealous now of kids who grow up with that stuff.
Right. Did you immediately start to gravitate towards them? As the more you played them, the more you saw just what was coming out and different things like that, or was it more of a standoffish approach until you really started to have them become a part of your life? I guess with your professional career.
I think I got over it pretty fast, and actually once I was in the working world. And I know we'll get to that too, but what happened there was I realized that that was a way to goof off at work. So once I discovered that there were games on computers, it was like, oh man, like we can actually get away with not working, because I had a series of jobs early on that I didn't like. So early on I gravitated towards Zork, the whole all the interactive fiction stuff, all the Infocom stuff. Because we could play it at our desks and bosses wouldn't know. And of course, back then, with the first graphic games like the Leisure Suit Larrys and things like that, there actually were literally boss keys. So you would press like F1 or whatever it is, and some like ridiculous bogus like spreadsheet would pop up on the screen. And clearly it was not your actual work, but if your boss just happened to be going by casually, it didn't look like a game either. Like, who knows? Maybe Green had some kind of spreadsheet work to do. Who the hell knows? I don't know why he would, but so it was really as a way to not work that I started discovering them on my own.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll be spending some more time talking about video games and kind of some of your favorites and whatnot as they started to come out more. Skipping ahead to the more of the present, you've kind of said that you're writing a novel at this point in time. I believe it's called Thecudgel of Xanth. Is that accurate?
Yeah. To say that I'm writing it right now would be misleading.
Yeah. How's that progressing?
Yeah. Well, it's been sitting in a binder. It probably has like a large like cake of dust on it right now. A draft of the novel exists from beginning to end. It started out as a NaNoWriMo project, which is the National Novel Writing Month event that happens in November every year, and it's at least a national, maybe an international event, I don't know, in which you are voluntarily committing to writing a novel in 30 days, and you submit your word count. They keep track of it to sort of make it legit. You don't really get anything for it, but you're mostly challenging yourself. So I decided to do that, and the title and the theme of the novel came out of a column that I wrote for Computer Gaming World. It was one of the Greenspeak columns I did, in which I had made up this fictional game studio and game, and the goal of the column at the time in the magazine was to write the world's worst game preview. I was trying to just write a parody of like all the bad previews that I was reading in magazines, including our own magazine. Like, previews in general are hard to write, and most of the time they suck, because you're in a game preview, you're sort of like stuck dealing with what they're telling you. Like, the game isn't out yet, so you have to just sort of take the PR shit that they shovel at you.
Sure.
And you also can't really be that critical, because you know it's not fair, because the game's not out yet. It's not done. So if you see it, if they're showing you an alpha and it's looking shitty, you can't really say that because it's not fair. So previews, like by their nature, end up being mostly like bullshit puff pieces. And so that's how I wrote this preview of the Thecudgel of Xanth. I wrote it with the like, this is the greatest game ever. I can't wait to play it. And yet, if you read it, like, I say nothing about it at all. Like, there's nothing in there. There's no content whatsoever. You know, I made it. I wrote it as, and I used bad language. I used terrible grammar. I just tried to write the worst possible preview I could. And the funny thing was, after all that, after trying so hard, and a lot of people got it, but I got more letters that were like, I never heard of that game. Like, when's that coming out? Like, how come I haven't heard of it? And I was like, oh my god. Like, I could, no matter how bad I write, someone's still going to believe that this is true. So anyway, so that happened, and then years later I left the magazine, but I remembered that whole experience, and I decided, why don't I write a novel about the making of that game? Because it was just always sitting there as a thing for me. So the novel is actually about the fictional studio that I created. They were named Brack Studios, and Brack is it's B-R-A-A-K, and I think that it's like Swedish for vomit. So they're making the game Thecudgel of Xanth. And actually, I wrote this novel after I worked at EA, and I know I keep jumping chronology here, but I had experience as a producer, my one and only experience as a game producer, and I went through a lot in that experience. And I think writing the book was sort of my way of processing what happened to me during my time as a game producer, learning what it was like to really be part of a game development team. So I was channeling a lot of my anger and a lot of the experience I went through into that. So anyway, so the book was about the making of that game, Thecudgel of Xanth. That was half of the book. The other half of the book was set in Xanthor's world, and it was his story from his perspective, and his world kept changing because the game kept changing, because marketing people and executives above at Brack Studios were telling them they had to change the game to make it like this. So then that would affect Xanthor in his world. So there was this whole meta thing going on. And when I go back and read it now, all of the Xanthor parts are actually pretty funny. Like, I did a really nice, good job of like fantasy parody in the manner of my idols Terry Pratchett and Neil Adams, and God forbid I'm not comparing myself to them, but it had that. I was going in that direction, and parts of it when I read it now are still funny, but the parts that I set in present time in Brack Studios just read bitter. and so I have this binder on my desk with like half of a pretty funny novel, and then half that's like, dude, you probably should have just gotten some therapy instead. So I know that there's some usable stuff in there, and I just need to take that binder and rip out all the shit and then redo it. There's something funny in there that I want to keep and hopefully publish.
Okay. I think out of all the questions that fans submitted, that was probably the number one question is where is the Thecudgel of Xanth?
I feel so bad because somehow it ended up on my wiki page, and like if you read it like today even, I think it says Jeff is working on his first novel, and it's like, no, I'm not. I'm not. Like, I was working on it like 3 years ago, and now it's sitting on a shelf making me feel guilty.
Okay.
But I can tell people that, like, it's sitting there. It's like the eternal, albatross on my back. Like, I know I have to get to it, and hopefully one day before we all die, people will get to read it.
Well, I'm sure all those fans will still be eagerly awaiting it whenever it does.
I hope not to let them down.
Come to life. I guess kind of the final question for this segment that I have, you touched on it earlier, but in a different life, do you think you might have been anything other than a full-on writer? I mean, you kind of were that for the most part. But is there anything you could have seen yourself doing other than writing for your life, for like your entire life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's certain things I can imagine doing only in sort of like I'll admit this as a completely this is like the 10-year-old boy in me that never left. But I was having this conversation with a couple of my friends a few weeks ago. I said out of the blue, like, uh, wouldn't you guys still like to be cops if you could? But like I'd be a terrible cop. I'd be terrible. I'm a coward. I have no, I'm weak. I don't. I abhor violence. I fear it. So, but like I have that little kid. Like it'd be great to have the uniform and ride around in a police car. But that's not a real answer to the question. That I wouldn't want that to get spread on the internet. In another life, Jeff Green wishes he was a policeman. Because I don't. That's just the 10-year-old boy in me that wishes I was a policeman. I think to really answer your question, no. Like I think what I would in an alternate life, what I wished I would have done is just committed to that earlier and believed in myself earlier and gone for it in a real way. Like I said, and we'll get to it, I hit writing in a roundabout way is instead of just going for it. And the bellwether that I have now is I have a cousin. I probably shouldn't name him. I don't want to. I mean, you could find out. It's easy enough. But I do have a cousin who's a very famous screenwriter, and he's a lot younger than me, and he's made some very famous movies now, including the Star Trek movies and the Mission Impossible movies and Fringe, the TV show, the new Sleepy Hollow show. Like he's an unbridled success as a writer, and I'm not jealous of him. I'm not, but I do think he had the kind of resources that I kind of didn't. And I wish I could have had his sort of resources because that's sort of the life I used to imagine that I would have. And I have no clue if I would have had the level of success he has. I mean, he's amazing. But when I think of another life, like not video game writing, it would have been like that kind of thing, like script writing or TV writing or something like that. That's the only thing I could really think of. I always wanted to be a writer.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think that wraps us up here for part one, guys. In part two, we'll be moving on to Jeff's professional life, and we'll talk all things Ziff Davis, CGW, One Up. It's all coming up in the next segment here. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We will see you next time here on Real Talk, and we'll see you in part number 2.